today's video, we are back to our series on top 10 greatest of all time in given positions, and today we are doing wide receivers. But before we get into the video, I wanted to take a second to ask you to please subscribe to the channel, ring the bell for notifications. Really helps us out. If you're a fan of the NFL, you'll love this channel as we release multiple NFL-related videos every Tuesday and Friday all year long. Now, let's get back to the video. At number 10, we're going to start with Michael Irvin, one of the member of the famous Dallas Cowboys triplets of the 1990s, along with Troy Aikman and Emmitt Smith. Michael Irvin helped this team to win 3 Super Bowls with one of the best teams ever constructed, and the team that Dallas Cowboys fans still remember and choose to remember over, any team since. Michael Irvin also feels like the very first diva wide receiver. I mean, this guy is as famous for his off-the-field shenanigans as he is for his on-the-field greatness. There's no doubt his greatness on the field, how good he was as a player, but this guy's had multiple sexual assault allegations. He has stabbed his own teammate in the neck with scissors in the locker room. He has had cocaine felony charges. He has done just about everything in the media. I'm shocked that he still gets significant TV airtime with all the stuff he's done and pulled. But either way, he is an entertaining TV personality. I can at least acknowledge that. And his football greatness is absolutely known to everybody out there. He was the reason that Troy Aikman was able to be such an effective quarterback. He was the reason that Emmitt Smith didn't have loaded boxes. This guy needs to be in the top 10 list, and so he squeaks in at number 10. At number 9, we have Lance Alworth, wide receiver for the San Diego Chargers, primarily during their time in the AFL, before eventually moving to the Dallas Cowboys after the AFL-NFL merger. Now, I don't have a ton of older guys on this top 10 list, primarily because the NFL really became much more of a passing and receiving league over the last couple of decades, as opposed to what it was prior to that, where it was very much so run it down teams' throats. But Lance Alworth is one of those older wide receivers that needs to be acknowledged as one of the wide receiver greats of all time. During the 60s, Alworth put up 3 seasons where he was the AFL's leader in receiving yards and 3 seasons where he was the AFL's leader in receiving touchdowns. This guy was clearly the best receiver of his era. He did things that nobody else was doing in a time where teams were not passing the football that much. Yet, if you look at his numbers, they look like modern-day elite receivers, not a receiver from the 1960s. And that's why Lance Alworth should absolutely go down as a top 10 receiver on this list. At number 8, we have Marvin Harrison, pictured here holding his son, who was the 4th overall pick in the most recent NFL draft, after the Indianapolis Colts won their NFL championship. Marvin Harrison's a guy who came into the NFL at 24 years old, much later than a lot of receivers, yet he was still able to put up 8 straight seasons of 1,000+ yards, leading the league in receiving yards twice, having more than 100 receiving yards per game in those seasons, helping the Colts, along with Peyton Manning and his wide receiver partner in crime towards the latter end of his career, Reggie Wayne, become one of the most prolific offenses in recent NFL history. During his prime, Marvin Harrison could do it all. During those 8 straight 1,000-yard seasons, he also had 10 or more touchdowns in every single one of those seasons, making him one of the most consistent and dominant wide receivers in recent history. Think about some other wide receivers in the league and how early they might have retired and how long Marvin Harrison was able to be an elite level wide receiver through injury, through aging, through everything else. This guy is just the model of consistency. He put up nearly 15,000 career receiving yards, which is just an unbelievably high number of receiving yards. He has a Super Bowl to his name. He basically has just done everything he could as a wide receiver, which is why he goes down as number 8 on our list. At number 7, we have Terrell Owens, another guy who might be more well known for his off-the-field persona as for his on-the-field greatness, but don't let that tell you that he was not one of the greatest wide receivers of all time on the football field. On the 49ers, he had the unenviable task of taking over for Jerry Rice after Rice ended up leaving the 49ers. Jerry Rice, we all know, is coming on this list and is one of the greatest NFL players of all time. And Terrell Owens had the job of replacing him in the 49ers offense and did, frankly, a remarkable job. The fact that it didn't feel like the 49ers lost at their receiver position during that turnover should show you how dominant a force Terrell Owens was during his 49ers years. And he might have gotten even better in his 1 year with the Philadelphia Eagles. And I say 1 year with the Eagles, I know he played 2, but the second year doesn't really count. And that's primarily because, he had some off the field issues. He was basically asked to leave the team. They got rid of him. Yeah, it was a whole mess. That whole season was a mess. But his 2004 with the Eagles, this guy was easily the best wide receiver in the league that year. No questions asked. Yes, he didn't necessarily lead the league in all the statistical categories, but in 14 games, he put up 1,200 yards. He put up 14 touchdowns, 1 touchdown per game. And then he broke his leg pretty much, which is why he missed those last 2 games of the season as well as some games in the playoffs. But he came back for the Super Bowl and absolutely balled out for the Eagles, doing everything he could on basically one leg, and nearly took the Eagles to winning the Super Bowl over the dynastic New England Patriots. That's how good Terrell Owens is. There are very few wide receivers in the history of the NFL who on one leg could nearly take their team to beating the greatest dynasty of the 21st century, bar none. And really, just if you look at every stat out there, Terrell Owens has it. Receiving yards, nearly 1,600 in his career. Touchdowns, over 150 in his career. He really did everything during his career in the NFL. The only sad part is that he did have so many press conferences, off the field issues that we do forget his greatness. But for this list, I'm not forgetting his greatness. Terrell Owens in at 7, lock it. At number 6, we got Larry Fitzgerald, and Larry Fitzgerald is just the ageless wonder. I don't know how this man was able to be such an effective receiver in the NFL for as long as he was. This man was putting up 1,000-yard seasons at 34 years old and was an effective receiver in the NFL all the way until his retirement after his age 37 season. No kidding, he still put up 400 yards in his age 37 season and over 800 yards in his age 36 season. There are receivers in the NFL right now, like a Julio Jones, who are doing nothing at age 34. And Fitzgerald was still starting and being a dominant force in the NFL at 36. The man has 9,000-yard seasons, 5 double-digit touchdown seasons, and the most impressive stat of them all, the man has more tackles in his career than he does dropped balls. What? No, this man played for some of the worst quarterbacks in the NFL during his time with the Cardinals. Really, the only effective quarterbacks I can ever remember him playing with were probably Carson Palmer and Kurt Warner. Yes, I think he briefly played with a young Kyler Murray, but I don't know how much we can totally count that, given Kyler Murray himself isn't that great, and that was him as a rookie and a 36, 37-year-old Larry Fitzgerald. But the fact that this guy was one of the best wide receivers in the NFL for the better part of 2 decades, and he did that with very little quarterback help, in the short period of time where he actually did have elite quarterback play, the Arizona Cardinals consistently went deep thanks to Larry Fitzgerald. When they made the Super Bowl against the Pittsburgh Steelers, there was nobody in the league who could do what Larry Fitzgerald did. This guy was a cultural icon at that point in time and the greatest wide receiver in the NFL, in an NFL that featured guys that have already been on this list and that are still to come on this list. That shows how good Larry Fitzgerald could have been had he played with elite wide receivers. But we still slot him in at 6 because even though he didn't have elite quarterback play, he's still one of the GOATs. At number 5, we have probably the oldest guy I'm going to put on any of these lists, Don Hudson, wide receiver for the Green Bay Packers in the 1930s and 40s. I mean, this guy is so old that this picture right here in black and white is the most crystal clear picture I can get of Mr. Hudson. And while I haven't seen Don Hudson play, obviously, I can look at what this guy did in the NFL during this time and understand he needs to be on this list. You cannot have a top receiver list and not put Don Hudson on it with how much better he was as a receiver than anybody else during his era. So let's start with the fact that this guy played in an era where there was only 11 games in a regular season. Not 16 or 17, 11. So he had to put up these stats in a significantly smaller sample size than other guys were able to do it in. And he still had a 1,200-yard receiving season. That's crazy. 1,200 yards in 11 games is insane for people in the modern day, let alone in the 30s and 40s when this guy was playing. He led the league in receiving yards in 7 of 11 seasons in the NFL. He led the league in receiving touchdowns in 9 of 11 seasons he was in the NFL. And if you look at his general stats, he had about 69 yards per game receiving. And you might say, well, that doesn't seem that impressive. Well, let's talk about where some guys we just showed on this list stood during their careers. Marvin Harrison Jr., 76.7 yards per game through his career. Pretty good. Terrell Owens, 72.8 yards per game for his career. A little bit less than Harrison, but still higher than Hudson. And Larry Fitzgerald, 66.5 yards per game for the duration of his career. That's actually less than Hudson. The fact that Hudson, playing in the 1930s and 40s, has per game stats that are every bit as comparable with other guys that are modern day receivers on this top 10 list, there's no doubt this guy has to be in this top 10 list in spite of the fact that he played nearly an entire century ago. And so that's why Don Hudson goes in here at number 5. At number 4, we have Steve Largent, Seattle Seahawks GOAT wide receiver. This guy played during the 70s and 80s, and he was really one of the first modern day wide receivers. I've already alluded to the fact that Jerry Rice is going to be on this list. I'm not going to lie about it. We all know it, so why not state it? But Steve Largent was really the Jerry Rice before Jerry Rice. This guy got going a little bit before Rice, and for a while actually held the highest receiving yards in the history of a career record before Jerry Rice took it over and just absolutely demolished it because he played into his 40s. But alongside that, Steve Largent had 8,000-yard receiving seasons. That's very good for playing in the 70s and 80s with not great quarterback play from Seattle Seahawks quarterbacks during this era. Beyond that, he put up 100 touchdowns during his career. He had massive longevity going well into his 30s as a very productive wide receiver. And with 5 All-Pro teams, 7 Pro Bowls, and actually coming close to an MVP very early in his career, you got to put Steve Largent pretty high. He definitely deserves to be this high as he is almost the prototype for the modern day wide receiver. I mean, alongside Jerry Rice, who's probably more the prototype, but Steve Largent did come just before Rice, so you got to give him credit. And now moving on to number 3, we have Calvin Johnson. This top 3 was really tough for me. I really probably could have gone any way with the top 3, but I ended up putting Calvin Johnson at number 3 based almost exclusively off his longevity being not very long. Calvin Johnson only played in the NFL for 9 seasons, significantly less than basically everybody else on this list. But even with only playing 9 seasons, he still put up 7,000-yard seasons. He still holds the NFL record for the most receiving yards in a single season, and he would have an 8,000-yard season if it wasn't for the fact that he missed a number of games in his 3rd season in the NFL, where he ended with just shy of 1,000. And his other season without 1,000 yards was his rookie season, where I believe John Kitna was his starting quarterback, so you can't blame him too much for that. I mean, come on. The guy put up 1,300 yards with Dante Culpepper as his quarterback when the Lions went 0-16. That's how good this guy was as a wide receiver. I remember when this guy was in his prime, a lot of the stats were he's the first player to ever do this, surpassing Jerry Rice. He was ahead of Jerry Rice's pace for a career in terms of receiving yards per game, receiving yards throughout a certain age of a career, receiving yards throughout a certain season of his career, etc., etc. Calvin Johnson was on pace to break all of Jerry Rice's records had he lasted for long enough. But Calvin Johnson did decide to retire after his age 30 season. And it's not like he was an ineffective wide receiver then. He still put up 1,200 receiving yards in that season. So in spite of the fact that Calvin Johnson only played 9 NFL seasons, he still put up 11,000 receiving yards, over 80 touchdowns. I mean, this guy just did it all throughout the entirety of his career. You can't take a lot off of Calvin Johnson. And so the only reason he's not higher on this list is because I acknowledge he doesn't have the longevity, but his prime was so good, you can't not put him this high. And to be clear, he is second all-time in receiving yards per game, only to Justin Jefferson, and we'll see how Justin Jefferson does once he starts to age or has injury issues like many other guys on this list got. But, I mean, in fairness, if Justin Jefferson doesn't, he's definitely joining this top 10. No doubt about that. At number 2, we have Randy Moss, and Randy Moss was just an absolute freak of a wide receiver. I mean, we still to this day talk about catching a ball over someone as mossing a guy because Randy Moss was just so good. Yet, that wasn't the only thing he did. He could also beat you long. He could beat you over the middle. This guy could beat you everywhere. He is probably the greatest wide receiver of the 21st century, and in my opinion, is the greatest wide receiver of the 21st century. And he was playing in the 90s to boot. Throughout his career, Randy Moss had 10,000-yard seasons and 9 seasons with over 10 touchdowns. 5 of those times he led the league in touchdowns because he could get touchdowns any way you wanted. Beat you over the top? Done. Beat you in space? Done. Beat you man on a fade route in the end zone? Done. No matter what you came at Randy Moss with, he could get to the end zone. He just had a nose for the thing. He has over 150 career touchdowns and just over 200 games. This guy had nearly 0.75 touchdowns per game. That's insane numbers. Having about 50% touchdown to games played ratio is incredibly good in the NFL. This guy had nearly 75%. He was that good at finding the end zone. And I mean, one of the biggest questions of all time is how much better could Randy Moss have been if he just cared a little bit more? I mean, his last year in Minnesota was terrible because he just didn't care about playing in Minnesota anymore. Then he went to the Raiders, and his last year in Oakland was terrible. And then he went to the Patriots, where, again, he was great immediately. So imagine if he just cared during those additional years, how much better his stats would be. He would be insane, and he might even be number 1 on this list had he cared during those seasons. But even in spite not necessarily trying his hardest throughout the entirety of his career, Randy Moss still belongs as number 2 on this list because of how great he was when he did care and try and put up the numbers we all knew he could. And at number 1, you knew it had to be Jerry Rice. I mean, come on, who else could it be? There's a reason that this guy was widely considered the GOAT prior to Tom Brady, even though he's not a quarterback. I mean, this guy in 21 seasons in the NFL, which alone is remarkable, put up over 23,000 receiving yards. That is over 1,000 yards per season on average for a guy that played until he was 42 years old. I mean, this guy put up 1,000-yard season for the Oakland Raiders at 40 years old. I mean, think about that. We are impressed when a guy puts up 1,000-yard season at like 32, 33 years old nowadays, and this guy was doing it at 40. Beyond that, he had 14 of his 21 seasons in the NFL where he put up over 1,000 receiving yards, including leading the league in receiving yards 6 times, and 9 seasons where he put up double-digit touchdowns, of which 6 of those seasons he led the NFL in receiving touchdowns. I mean, this guy just did it all. He won 3 Super Bowls in his time with San Francisco, 2 of which with Joe Montana, 1 with Steve Young. And just his longevity, his overall statistics, his peak, everything is elite, if not the best there is at his position. And so when you combine all that together, there is no question Jerry Rice is the number 1 greatest receiver of all time. And this is one of, if not the hardest individuals to topple in terms of how much higher he is than everyone else. Either way, that's it for our top 10 greatest wide receivers of all time. If you enjoyed this video, remember to leave a like and comment down below. Help us out, help us grow. Either way, I'll see you all next time. Peace!